Well, the Lord is risen indeed. Easter brought us faith, and then yet a mere week later, we're back to a place of discomfort and doubt. I don't know that this is really all that unusual. People can't hold on to belief all that well. I started diet believing that I'm going to be able to see the person inside that's thinner, healthier, and happier, only to question my resolve as soon as the dessert cart comes around. The fact that they kept on to their faith for a few days is better than I do. So the disciples had seen their leader die a horrible death. And instead of being at the head of a mighty army throwing out the colonizers, he hung lifeless at Passover, unable to even be buried properly. No wonder an empty tomb brought more questions than answers for his believers. Last week, we know that the women had seen someone at the tomb, and that person had told them that Jesus was not there, but would see them in Galilee. They were too afraid to tell anyone. I suppose they didn't want to be told that they were just grieving and hearing what they wanted to hear, or had been fooled by someone in the garden. It's likely that they questioned what the stranger meant when he said that Jesus would join them in Galilee, when they clearly saw Jesus dead on a cross. It's one thing to have a missing body and an empty tomb. It's another thing to believe in a dead man speed walking to Galilee. So 8 days after the crucifixion, John tells us that despite being in a locked room because of their fear, Jesus appeared before the disciples and greeted them with, "Peace be with you," and then showing them the marks of his torture. Not a real peaceful image, and yet he said, "Peace be with you." They believed, but Thomas wasn't there, and when he shows up, they tell him all about what happened. And he says, "I don't believe it. I can't believe it." Probably he was thinking, you guys got way too drunk on the Seder. It's not enough for him to hear about what others have seen. He needs to see it himself and to experience it himself. For him, it isn't enough to hear it from others. It's not even enough to hear it and see it for himself. He has to touch Christ to know that the story is true. And we're often told that Thomas is a failure in faith because he doubted. But let's be honest. How many of us would have heard that story and said, "Oh, sure, I believe that"? Realistically, we all would have doubted. There's nothing wrong with doubt. So a week later, they're once again meeting, only this time Thomas is there. Jesus once again appears, but he knows that Thomas needs more than the others. More reassurance, more touch. He offers his hands and his side to be examined as closely as Thomas needs in order to know that Jesus is truly there with him. And the first thing that struck me when reading this gospel is how focused Jesus is on comforting his friends. They're in the midst of doubt and fear, and the first thing he offers them is peace. Peace through his presence, through his words, and through his willingness to be what the apostles needed him to be. Many do take Jesus' words as chiding Thomas, but I don't see them that way. Jesus doesn't refuse to be physically present to Thomas, after all. He holds out his hands. He exposes his side. He's basically telling him to take what you need in order to be comforted. He lets them know that there are others who will be blessed by being able to believe without this tactile proof of his presence. But he isn't saying that that's how he ought to be. Jesus meets Thomas and us where we are and offers comfort however we need it. But that comfort isn't something he offers for them alone. It isn't permission to hide out in a locked room, hiding from people who may not like the message. He offers them comfort in order to offer it to others. He breathes on them in the same way that God breathed on the dust in order to create humanity. They are in a very real way reanimated by his gift of the Holy Spirit to carry on Jesus' mission. Belief is a tricky thing. Almost from the beginning, there were concerns about what it meant to believe in Jesus' resurrection. What does resurrection mean? Theologian Marcus Borg points out that the meaning of Easter is twofold. Jesus lives and Jesus is Lord. Both claims are essential. Easter means that Jesus was experienced after his death and that he is both Lord and Christ. That's from Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, which I highly recommend and may still be on sale at Amazon for $1.99. From the very beginning, people have questioned what it means for Jesus to have been alive after his death on the cross. For some, Thomas's touching Jesus' side and the nail holes in his hands meant that he was literally, physically present, as though a video camera could have captured the events they talked about. Dr. Borg points out that this is technically not resurrection. This is resuscitation. Lazarus was resuscitated, as was Jairus' daughter. They returned to a bodily existence from which they would presumably begin their inexorable movement towards death once again. Resurrection is something different. For Paul, one of our earliest writers on this subject, resurrection is entry into a new kind of existence, much like a seed becomes a plant. The seed and the plant are the same thing, and yet they are very different. Jesus' resurrected body could be as different from one another as a plant is from a seed. It could involve a physical body. It doesn't have to. Jesus' return to his friends came not to show off his body, but to share with him his spirit. It was the Holy Spirit he breathed on them to help them continue God's work in the world, a light that pulled them out of the darkness of doubt and despair and into a new life that would help them to continue the ministry. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus met the disciples, and they didn't even recognize him. He spent time talking to them about all that they had seen and heard and interpreted in the light of the scriptures. They didn't realize it, but Jesus was still with them. That spirit is not merely a historical experience of other people. Jesus walks with us, whether or not we know that he's there. For Borg, it isn't the tomb that matters as much as the experience of Jesus being with us right now, offering up his Holy Spirit to help us engage in being living members of Jesus. The second aspect of the Easter experience is that Jesus is Lord. Lazarus returned from the dead, as did Jairus' daughter, but no one looked at them and saw them as the Lord. Their resurrections were part of seeing God's presence at work in the world. But when Jesus is resurrected, he was experienced as having the qualities of God. According to Board, he was a spiritual reality just as God was, and could be experienced anywhere, by anyone. As Thomas falls to his knees, he says, "My Lord and my God." Jesus wasn't confined to what a human being could do. He was more than a political figure doomed to failure against a great Roman powerhouse. He was more than any power. He is more than any power. He was and is the Lord of our lives that no other power, political, social, or other, could ever be. For Board, the essential experience of Jesus is as the risen Christ, a continuing presence more important than the historical experience of the disciples and how they attributed meaning to their experience. That experience helps them inform our tradition, but we are more than just the history of Christian tradition. What is important is that we still experience the breath of the Holy Spirit comforting us, calling us to be his heart and hands in the world. When we have locked the world out in fear, Jesus calls us out of our solitude to minister to his people. Whether we see him as a physical presence, an apparition, a ghost, a bit of sunlight, or as the answer to our prayers. And even when we, like the men on the road to Emmaus, don't even realize he's there, he is still with us, breaking us free. Amen.
Amen.